Along the narrow Levantine coast of the eastern Mediterranean, a series of independent city-states emerged during the Late Bronze and Early Iron Ages, laying the foundations for what modern scholars call Phoenician civilization. This is where their story begins, not in legend, but in geography. The region that ancient sources referred to, and that scholars today study as Phoenicia, corresponds roughly to the coastal areas of present-day Lebanon, with extensions into northern Israel and coastal Syria. The land is defined by stark contrasts. The towering Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges rise sharply from the coast, leaving only a narrow strip of fertile lowland between rock and sea. This geographic compression, many researchers argue, shaped the Phoenician world more profoundly than any political decision. The mountains served as natural barriers, limiting agricultural expansion into the interior. As documented by geographers and archaeologists, including scholars affiliated with the American University of Beirut and the Oriental Institute of Chicago, this constrained hinterland pushed Levantine coastal communities outward toward the sea for their economic sustenance. Cedar and pine forests on the mountain slopes provided exceptional timber resources, materials that would later feature prominently in ancient trade records from Egypt and Mesopotamia. The coastline itself offered a series of natural harbors, rocky promontories, and offshore islands that provided protection for early anchorage. The sites of Byblos, ancient Gubla, Sidon, ancient Sida, and Tyre, ancient Sur, are among those with the longest documented occupation histories in the region. Archaeological evidence at Byblos, for instance, indicates continuous habitation stretching back to the Neolithic period, with significant urban development by the early Bronze Age. The climate of the eastern Mediterranean coast, marked by wet winters and dry summers, supported olive cultivation, viticulture, and cereal farming on available lowland soils. However, as historian and archaeologist Glenn Marco documented in his 2000 work, Peoples of the Past, Phoenicians, the environmental limits of this terrain made agriculture insufficient as a sole economic base for growing populations. This ecological pressure, scholars broadly agree, was a structural driver behind the development of craft production, trade, and maritime activity for which Phoenician culture would become known. It is important to note at the outset what Phoenician means and what it does not. The people who inhabited these city-states did not call themselves Phoenicians. That name derives from the ancient Greek word phoinikes, likely referring to the purple-red dye traded from this coast, or possibly to the region's association with the color in Greek perception. The inhabitants of Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and other centers identified with their individual cities as Giblites, Sidonians, or Tyrians, not as members of a unified ethnic or political bloc. This distinction, emphasized in modern scholarship by researchers such as Josephine Quinn in her 2018 work In Search of the Phoenicians, is critical to understanding the political structure of these communities. If you're finding this journey through ancient history valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring more carefully researched documentaries like this one to you. Share it with anyone who loves history, and leave a comment below. Which Phoenician city-state would you most want to have visited? Understanding when and how the Phoenician city-states emerged requires engaging with one of the more complex transitions in ancient Near Eastern history: the collapse of the Late Bronze Age international system around 1200 BCE and the societal reorganizations that followed. The Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was characterized by a network of interconnected palace economies. Egypt, Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit on the Syrian coast, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the cities of the Levantine coast maintained diplomatic, commercial, and tributary relationships. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Ugarit and from El Amarna in Egypt attest to active correspondence and trade between Levantine coastal rulers and the major imperial powers of the period. Around 1200–1150 BCE, this interconnected system underwent severe disruption. The precise causes remain actively debated among scholars. The Sea Peoples migrations, documented in Egyptian texts and inscriptions at Medinet Habu under Ramesses III, were once considered the primary driver of Bronze Age collapse. More recent scholarship, including work by Eric Klein in his 2014 study, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, argues for a systems collapse model. The interaction of drought, internal rebellions, disrupted trade networks, and migrations created cascading failures that no single factor can explain. Ugarit, a major Levantine trading city north of the Phoenician core region, was destroyed around this time and never rebuilt. In contrast, the Levantine coastal sites further south, including Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, survived the period of disruption, though archaeological records show evidence of destruction layers and population shifts at several sites. What emerged in the aftermath, from roughly the 11th century BCE onward, is a pattern of urban recovery and reorientation that modern scholars identify as the beginning of the Phoenician Iron Age florescence. Tyre, in particular, appears to have grown significantly in prominence during the Iron Age. Classical sources, including the Greek historian Menander of Ephesus, as quoted by the Jewish historian Josephus, reference a king named Hiram I of Tyre, who ruled in the 10th century BCE and was credited with urban expansion, temple construction, and diplomatic relations with the Israelite kingdom under Solomon. The historicity of these accounts is debated, and they must be treated with the caution appropriate to their late date and textual transmission, but they are consistent with archaeological evidence suggesting Tyre's growing importance in the Iron Age Levant. Byblos, meanwhile, had a longer documented connection with Egypt. Texts and artifacts from Egyptian Old and Middle Kingdom periods record the importation of cedar timber from the Byblos region, and Egyptian religious influences are visible in the archaeological remains of the city. Scholars including Donald Redford have extensively documented this Egypt-Byblos relationship, noting that it represents one of the oldest continuously attested long-distance trade relationships in the ancient world. The process by which these cities consolidated political and economic authority in the post-Bronze Age environment was gradual and, in many respects, locally specific. There was no political unification, no Phoenician empire. Instead, individual city-states developed their own institutions, dynasties, and spheres of commercial influence. The Phoenician city-states are perhaps most widely recognized for their role as maritime traders and navigators of the ancient Mediterranean. This reputation, rooted in both ancient textual evidence and modern archaeology, reflects a genuine historical reality, though one that benefits from careful scholarly qualification. Maritime trade in the eastern Mediterranean long predates the Iron Age Phoenician florescence. Obsidian from the Aegean island of Melos was distributed across the eastern Mediterranean basin as early as the Neolithic period. Bronze Age Ugarit and the Levantine coast were already integrated into maritime exchange networks. What the Iron Age Phoenician city-states contributed was, in part, an intensification and geographic expansion of these earlier traditions, particularly as the western Mediterranean opened to sustained long-distance contact. The primary commodity most closely associated with Phoenician trade was purple dye derived from the Murex sea snail, Hexaplex trunculus and Murex brandaris, found in the coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological excavations at Sidon, Tyre, and other sites have revealed large deposits of crushed murex shells, indicating industrial-scale dye production. The color produced, ranging from crimson to deep violet depending on processing, was extraordinarily labor-intensive to manufacture and commanded high prices in ancient markets. Textual references to this dye appear in Egyptian, Assyrian, and later Greek and Roman sources. In addition to purple cloth, Phoenician traders dealt in cedar and other timber, glass, for which the Levantine coast was an important production center in the ancient world, metalwork, grain, wine, olive oil, and human labor in the form of enslaved persons.
It must be noted that the ancient slave trade was a pervasive feature of Mediterranean economies, and Phoenician merchants, like their contemporaries, participated in it. Modern scholarship has been attentive to the need to address this honestly rather than sanitize the ancient record. Phoenician ships are described in ancient sources including the Hebrew Bible and Homer's Odyssey, the latter referring to Sidonians skilled in craftsmanship. Archaeological evidence for Phoenician shipbuilding is limited, but representations on Assyrian palace reliefs from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, particularly those from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, depict Levantine ships with characteristics consistent with what scholars expect of Phoenician maritime technology. Round-hulled vessels with both sail and oar capability, suitable for open water navigation. The extent of Phoenician geographic reach has been a subject of ongoing scholarly interest. Classical sources credit Phoenician sailors with circumnavigating Africa at the behest of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II in the late 7th or early 6th centuries BCE, an account recorded by Herodotus, who expressed his own skepticism. Whether this voyage occurred remains debated. What is more firmly established, through a combination of archaeological evidence and ancient texts, is the Phoenician role in establishing trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus and the Aegean to Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, the North African coast, and the Iberian Peninsula.
One of the defining characteristics of Phoenician civilization, and a point that modern scholars consistently emphasize, is its fundamental political fragmentation. There was no Phoenician state, no unified monarchy, no shared political identity that transcended the individual city. The Phoenician world was, at its core, a world of city-states, politically sovereign, locally governed, and often commercially competitive with one another. Each major Phoenician city was governed by a monarchy, with kings holding both political and religious authority. Ancient Near Eastern texts, including Assyrian annals and Egyptian administrative documents, consistently address Phoenician rulers as kings of their individual cities rather than as representatives of any broader political unit. The king of Tyre is distinct from the king of Sidon. They could be allies, rivals, or tributaries of larger empires at different points in their histories. Alongside the monarchy, ancient sources and some inscriptional evidence suggest the existence of councils of elders or merchant elites who held significant influence in city governance. Classical sources describe a council in Carthage, the Phoenician colony in North Africa, and scholars such as Sabatino Moscati have suggested that similar consultative institutions may have functioned in the mother cities of the Levantine coast, though direct evidence for the internal political structures of cities like Tyre and Sidon in this early period is limited. The relationship of Phoenician city-states to the great empires of their era was complex and variable. During periods of Assyrian expansion in the 9th through 7th centuries BCE, Levantine cities were subjected to increasing pressure. Assyrian annals record tribute payments from cities including Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos to Assyrian kings including Ashur-nasir-pal II, Shalmaneser III, and Tiglath-Pileser III. These payments should not be taken as evidence of passive submission. The Levantine cities also engaged in resistance, diplomatic maneuvering, and at times revolt. Tyre, in particular, demonstrated remarkable resilience under Assyrian pressure. The city's location on an island off the coast, physically separated from the mainland, provided a defensive advantage that frustrated Assyrian sieges. Ancient sources record prolonged sieges of Tyre by Shalmaneser V and later by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, with outcomes that remain partially unclear in the archaeological and textual record. The later, more fully documented siege by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, which required the construction of a causeway to breach the island's defenses, attests to the enduring strategic challenge the city's location presented to besieging forces.
This political independence of individual city-states, combined with their economic sophistication, allowed Phoenician communities to adapt to changing imperial environments over several centuries, negotiating, trading, and at times thriving under the oversight of Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Persian imperial administrations. Among the most consequential contributions attributed to the Phoenician city-states is the development and transmission of an alphabetic writing system that stands, in modified form, at the root of most alphabetic scripts in use today, including the Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew alphabets, among others. This is not a minor historical footnote. It represents one of the most significant information technology transitions in human history. The Phoenician script, an abjad, a consonantal alphabet without written vowels, developed from earlier Semitic writing traditions. Its immediate ancestors include Proto-Sinaic and Proto-Canaanite scripts attested in the 2nd millennium BCE, and its relationship to earlier writing systems is an area of active scholarly investigation. The earliest clearly identifiable Phoenician alphabetic inscriptions date to approximately the 11th to 10th centuries BCE, with the inscription on the sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos among the most frequently cited early examples, though its precise dating has been subject to scholarly revision. The Greek adoption and adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet, adding vowel signs to produce the first fully phonemic alphabet in the historical record, is a well-documented process, though the precise mechanisms and timeline of transmission remain subjects of scholarly discussion. Greek tradition itself attributed the alphabet's introduction to a Phoenician figure named Cadmos, and while mythological accounts cannot be taken as historical record, they reflect an ancient recognition of the script's Near Eastern origin. Phoenician religion centered on a polytheistic pantheon with significant overlap with other Canaanite religious traditions. The principal deities included Baal, a storm and fertility god, Astarte, associated with love, war, and celestial bodies, El, a senior patriarchal deity, Melkart, the patron deity of Tyre, closely identified with the city's royal dynasty, and Eshmun, a healing deity associated with Sidon. Ancient sources, including biblical texts and classical descriptions, provide textual evidence for Phoenician religious practice, though these sources often reflect the perspectives and polemics of outsiders. A practice referenced in both ancient texts and the archaeological record, and one that has generated significant scholarly debate, is the alleged sacrifice of children in Phoenician and Carthaginian religious contexts, referred to in ancient sources as the Tophet, a sacred precinct where urns containing cremated remains of young children have been found at Carthage and other sites. Whether these deposits represent sacrificial victims, as classical sources claim, or the burial grounds of children who died of natural causes, remains one of the more contentious debates in Phoenician studies. Scholars including Lawrence Steger and Joseph Green have argued for the sacrificial interpretation based on the evidence. Others, including Paolo Excella and Josephine Quinn, have published research questioning aspects of the sacrifice hypothesis. This is an area where the scholarly debate is ongoing, and definitive conclusions should not be presented. Cultural exchange operated in multiple directions. Phoenician craftspeople were sought by other polities for their expertise. The Hebrew Bible describes Phoenician artisans participating in the construction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and Assyrian palatial art shows Phoenician-style ivories incorporated into royal contexts. Phoenician cultural influence in the Western Mediterranean, carried by colonization and trade, shaped the material culture of early Iron Age populations across a wide geographic area. The Phoenician city-states did not exist in isolation. Their histories were shaped at every turn by interactions with the major powers of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, sometimes as tributaries, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as cultural intermediaries, and occasionally as adversaries. Three relationships stand out for their depth and historical significance, those with Egypt, Assyria, and the Greek world. The Egypt-Byblos connection is among the oldest attested in the ancient record. From the early dynastic period onward, Egyptian demand for cedar timber, absent from Egypt's own environment, drove sustained contact with Levantine coastal communities. The so-called Byblos ships, referenced in Egyptian administrative texts, were vessels specifically associated with the cedar trade route. Egyptian artifacts, including inscribed objects and religious items, are found in the archaeological deposits of Byblos, and Egyptian influence is visible in the city's religious architecture and iconography. The Wennemon Report, a literary or administrative text dating to approximately the 11th century BCE, describes an Egyptian envoy's difficult mission to obtain cedar from Byblos, a document that, whatever its precise genre, provides a vivid illustration of the complexities of Egyptian-Levantine relations during a period of Egyptian political weakness. Assyrian relations with the Phoenician city-states were characterized by periodic military pressure, tribute extraction, and commercial integration. Assyrian imperial expansion into the Levant, documented in the royal annals of successive kings from the 9th century BCE onward, brought Phoenician cities into tributary relationships with the empire. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad are all named in Assyrian records as cities that paid tribute. The relationship, however, was not purely extractive. Assyrian demand for luxury goods, including Phoenician purple cloth, ivories, metalwork, and glass, integrated the Levantine craft economy into an imperial market. Some scholars, including Mario Liverani, have argued that Assyrian imperialism, in certain respects, stimulated rather than simply suppressed Levantine commercial activity. The siege and eventual sack of Sidon by Esarhaddon of Assyria around 677 BCE, documented in Assyrian texts, represents a more brutal dimension of these relations. Sidon was reportedly destroyed, its king executed, and a new city built on its ruins. The episode illustrates the vulnerability of Phoenician cities to imperial violence when they resisted or were perceived as threatening Assyrian interests. Phoenician interaction with the Greek world unfolded over centuries and across multiple registers: trade, colonization, cultural exchange, and eventually political competition. Greek and Phoenician traders operated in overlapping geographic zones: Cyprus, the Aegean, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Western Mediterranean. And the evidence for interaction includes Greek pottery found in Phoenician contexts and vice versa. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provides numerous references to Phoenicians, though his accounts must be assessed critically as they reflect Greek perspectives and the concerns of his own era. The colonization of the Western Mediterranean by both Greek and Phoenician communities in the Iron Age created zones of complex cultural interaction. The Phoenician colony of Carthage in present-day Tunisia, traditionally dated by ancient sources to the late 9th century BCE, though archaeological evidence for the earliest levels is limited, became over time the most powerful Phoenician-derived polity in the ancient world, eventually entering into prolonged conflict with Rome in the Punic Wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE.
The study of Phoenician civilization has undergone significant revision in recent decades, and an honest educational account requires acknowledging both the established foundations of the field and the debates that remain unresolved. One of the most prominent recent scholarly contributions is Josephine Quinn's 2018 book, In Search of the Phoenicians, which challenges the concept of Phoenician as a coherent ethnic or cultural identity held by the people themselves. Quinn argues that Phoenician was essentially an external label, applied by Greeks and later by Romans and by modern scholars, and that the inhabitants of cities like Tyre and Sidon identified primarily with their city, not with any broader Phoenician community. This argument has been influential, though it has also prompted debate and some disagreement from scholars who argue that shared cultural practices, religious traditions, and language do constitute a meaningful, if loosely defined, cultural sphere. The question of Phoenician colonization, its extent, its character, and its relationship to colonial practices of other ancient cultures is another area of active debate.
The term colony itself carries modern connotations that may not accurately capture the variety of Phoenician overseas foundations, which ranged from small trading posts to substantial urban settlements. Archaeology has been essential in refining the picture, with ongoing excavations at sites in Spain, Sardinia, and North Africa continually adding to and revising scholarly understanding. The legacy of the Phoenician city-states of the Iron Age Levant were remarkable not because they built the largest empire or the most enduring monuments, but because of what they connected, transmitted, and exchanged. In geography, commerce, craft, and writing, they served as a conduit between civilizations, and the traces of that role persist in various forms to the present day. Archaeologically, the Levantine coast and the sites of Phoenician settlement across the Mediterranean continue to yield new evidence. Underwater archaeology has been particularly productive, with surveys off the coasts of Lebanon, Israel, and elsewhere revealing shipwrecks, harbor structures, and trade goods that expand the documentary record. The field remains dynamic, and any account of Phoenician civilization, including this one, reflects a snapshot of scholarship at a particular moment, subject to revision as research continues. The Phoenician city-states of the Iron Age Levant were remarkable not because they built the largest empire or the most enduring monuments, but because of what they connected, transmitted, and exchanged. In geography, commerce, craft, and writing, they served as a conduit between civilizations, and the traces of that role persist in various forms to the present day.